Social media world. We are about to start on the People's Budget Teach-In, the City Budget 101. Wait a couple seconds for folks to join or to see this live stream. My name is Elsa Tung. I am the Land Use Program Manager at Long Beach Forward. This is part of a series of budget teach-ins that we're doing for this year's People's Budget Campaign, fiscal year 2022. So stay tuned, stay put. We'll get into it in just a few seconds. Welcome, welcome. Okay, well, we'll get started. Once again, my name is Elsa Tung. I'm the Land Use Program Manager at Long Beach Forward. Long Beach Forward is part of, and you'll see all of these logos down at the bottom of the screen. Long Beach Forward is part of the People's Budget Campaign. We've actually been, we and a number of the organizations you see logoed below have been organizing the People's Budget since 2018. Since 2018, that would be fiscal year 2019, to really fight for communities' priorities in the city budget. Primarily and most prominently last year, after the number one, the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic, and number two, the police murders nationwide that sparked protests of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many more, including many of our own Long Beach neighbors, Dante Jordan, Faraz Murad, and many more. We have been explicit in calling for the defunding of the Long Beach Police Department and the investing, maybe not necessarily reinvesting, but the investing in Black lives, communities of color, and marginalized communities through very specific budget asks. This past year of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter uprisings against police brutality have awakened more and more people to the value of community and humanity. The generational impacts of the still ongoing pandemic have only widened the existing racial, wealth, and health gaps. We are all bearing witness to systemic oppressions driven by racism, capitalism, and white supremacy. So today we are at a critical juncture in the long-term recovery of and healing of our city and our nation. We need a just recovery, a people's recovery after these devastating crises. A people's recovery that puts Black lives at the center, prioritizes and protects marginalized communities, and fundamentally reimagines community safety. So today, and next slide, please. Today we are doing a teach-in as part of a series of teach-ins. This past weekend, Black Lives Matter Long Beach hosted their teach-in calling for care, not cops, and unpacking what does that mean? What does care, not cops mean, and why is that important? Today we're doing City Budget 101, and tonight at 5:30, our partners at Long Beach Immigrant Rights Coalition are doing a teach-in about how to give public comment. This is all leading up to tomorrow, Tuesday, August 10th, where we will be doing a massive day of action at City Hall, including an additional teach-in about police harms, the police budget and police harms to the community. So we'll do this call to action at the end, but just wanted to let you know this is a series of teach-ins, and today we'll focus on City Budget 101. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we're going to take a look at understanding the Long Beach City budget, just the super basics. We're going to analyze city budget services. What does the budget fund in the city of Long Beach? We're going to unpack the police budget. We're going to go through the city budget process. This year is a pretty atypical year. And we're going to briefly go through the people's budget for this fiscal year. You can read more at the people's budget at lbforward.org/people's budget. So we won't go super in detail, but today is meant to really unpack kind of what is the existing city budget and the proposed budget. And finally, we're going to call to action, as I just mentioned, with the day of action tomorrow, Tuesday, August 10th at City Hall at 5:00 p.m. Next slide, please. So just super basic. What is a budget? A budget is a plan for matching resources to needs. It's a plan to lay out the expected resources over the next year and how to allocate them. A budget is updated every year, every fiscal year, not calendar year. In the city of Long Beach, that fiscal year is October through September, which actually follows the national government fiscal year. And finally, a budget is a statement of values and priorities. Next slide. What is budget advocacy? So as I just left off with, budget is a statement of values and priorities. Budgets are moral documents, as you'll see in the blue. They tell the story of the priorities and the gaps that there are in public investments. So by understanding how the city funds programs and services, the community can mobilize to push for equity and justice in spending decisions. Budget advocacy is organizing to change the way that public resources are aligned to meet community needs. Budget advocacy can help align the community around a set of community priorities. That is the people's budget. Next slide. What does the city budget fund? There are lots of different kinds of budgets, state budget, federal budget. We're talking here about the city budget. This is also to be separate from the school district. The school district is a whole other sort of level of government that is different from the city of Long Beach. But what does the city of Long Beach budget fund? It funds youth recreation and library programs, health, wellness, and prevention programs. We are still in a global pandemic. It is not over yet. Many of us are vaccinated, but many in our community are not. Many around the country and around the world are not vaccinated. We still need to prioritize health, wellness, and prevention during and after this global pandemic. The city budget also funds streets and sidewalks, cleaning and maintenance. We've got public works, which kind of covers so many basic and core services that a city has. Not only streets and sidewalks, but trash and recycling. Dealing with water. Where does our stormwater go and get captured, and what is that infrastructure like? Just the sort of the bricks and mortar and the nuts and bolts of what city services are. The city budget also funds economic development, affordable housing, community planning, and housing code enforcement. And finally, yes, the city does fund, and we're going to argue here that the city funds inordinately, disproportionately, police, fire, and emergency services, and particularly disproportionately police. Next slide. The total city budget this fiscal year is about $3 billion. $3 billion. But that actually, 80% of that $3 billion is so-called restricted. It's already sort of designated funds to go to designated purposes and uses. There's 20% of the city budget that is unrestricted. And that's basically what's known as the general fund. And so we're really only looking at 20% of the overall $3 billion budget. And that, again, is the non-restricted or flexible or discretionary general fund. Next slide. So again, this general fund this year is about $625 million to be proposed. Most of that is going to come from taxes, sales taxes and property taxes, i.e. our own, like any Long Beach resident or business, we're paying into the general fund. And that's the vast majority of where the general fund gets its revenue from. 31% of the general fund is services, fees, permits, fines, which again, many of us pay for. So really the general fund is an overall reflection of what we as Long Beach residents and the Long Beach community, we pay into the general fund. But what do we get out of it? That's kind of the big question. Next slide. So let's see how this proposed $625 million is divvied up. This is a bit of a simplified slide for a reason. We want to kind of show where the vast majority of the funding is going. The vast majority of the funding is going to two single departments, police and fire. And from this slide, you'll see that police are proposed to get $262 million out of this budget. That's about 42% of this budget, of this general fund. Fire is going to get about $117 million, about 19%. So those two departments alone are getting the majority of the general fund. And again, police is disproportionately getting 42% of this year's general fund. You'll see that tiny little yellow sliver. That's the health department. The health department is getting less than 1% of this year's general fund. Now, the city will argue that that's because the health department gets is funded by different funding sources, including state and federal grants. But this is extremely problematic if you see just this tiny little sliver for the health department and a huge chunk for the police department. What does that mean for where our city is putting its values and priorities? In the green, you'll see about 16% of the general fund is for a combined library, parks, and public works. Again, like I was just saying, these are the basic fundamental services that a city provides. Parks are becoming so important, have become so important during this pandemic when we cannot leave our homes or have been unable to leave our homes for a large chunk of time. Where do we go? We need parks and open spaces. Parks also provide critical youth and senior programming. Just so critical during these past years and beyond. The next largest chunk there in orange is 22%. That's other departments. That's sort of a combined chunk of government administration, like the city manager, the city attorney, city council, and the mayor, all of that sort of government administration, as well as the economic development department and the development services department. I mean, if you look at these chunks, all of those departments are about half of the police budget. Or if you look at the green chunk, the library, parks, and public works, that's less than half. So those three departments combined are less than half of the police budget. What is wrong with this picture? Let's go deeper a bit into the police budget. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Before we do that, let's look at a sort of a long-term analysis of the past 15 years. As you'll see, the coloration is a little bit different, but the police budget has always been way up there in that red line, far and above away all of the other departments. So if you look at the other critical services, essential services in the gray line down below, that's parks, library, public works, and health, and the health department combined. That has basically stayed stagnant over the past 15 years. And the police department budget in red has sort of had some ups and downs, but primarily has gone up steadily every year since about, I believe that's fiscal year 13 or so. 13 or actually fiscal year 16, sorry. So that's just sort of a long-term look. This is not new news that the police department is disproportionately funded. It's been this way for the past many, many years. And hey, it looks like in this year it's continuing. Next slide. So what does the fiscal year 22 police department budget look like? Look, after all of what we went through last year, the start of the COVID pandemic, the uprisings triggered by extraordinary police violence, and these were global uprisings. And the city of Long Beach had a process for racial equity and racial reconciliation. Out of all of that, there was, at least initially, a reckoning that that police budgets were a thing, were potentially a problem. But with that, this year's police budget, I don't know, somehow seems to ignore the trauma and the uprisings of the past year, and actually has increased the budget overall. This is the total police department budget. This is not just out of the general fund. So you'll, from the previous slide, the general fund police budget was, hold on one second, was 262 million. This is showing 285 million, and that's because, again, this is coming from not only the general fund, but other sources of funding as well. So the total police budget is 285 million. How is that divvied up? The vast majority of it is divvied up into salaries and benefits of both sworn officers and civilian personnel. Over 60% of the department are sworn officers. There are about 800 sworn officers in the department. We'll sort of get more into that in the next slide. But what we see here is about almost 80% is salaries and benefits. 14% is interfund support. I think my understanding of that means it's sort of fund transfers between different departments. 4% in that gray chunk is overtime. And 3% is materials and supplies. And we don't have time to go into this right now, but Long Beach Immigrant Rights Coalition and Black Lives Matter Long Beach have been leading the charge on uncovering police surveillance technology, which is basically this 3% of the police budget. There's a lot of extremely problematic and invasive and racist technology, like facial recognition technology, that the police department is spending on. Let's go to the next slide. So remember, as we saw, the vast majority of the police budget is salaries and benefits. The average Long Beach Police Department officer compensation is about $215,000 per year. That's just one officer, average, $250,000 per year, salary and benefits. Imagine what can 10 officers, that's about $2 million. What can $2 million pay for that 10 cops cannot? It's just, yeah, the comparisons here are astounding. Next slide. The police budget versus everything else. So look, for every $1 the police budget, the city of Long Beach spends on police, it only spends 60 cents on our health department. Imagine if those numbers were reversed. Imagine if our city prioritized health over police violence. So much can be said also about the police department. Actually, go back to the previous slide, please, if you can. Thank you. What if we prioritized health over the police? This slide is showing $250,000 per year on police salaries. And we know for a fact that violent police who have committed shootings and murders, are still on the police force. Our taxpayer dollars are still paying these officers an average of $215,000 per year for violent offenders and violent police officers. Imagine how this money can be reallocated and reinvested. Next slide. And next slide. Again, police budget versus everything else. For every $1 the city of Long Beach spends on police, it spends only 23 cents on our parks. Imagine if our city leaders really cared about our youth, our seniors, and our health programs. Next slide. So this is a slide from the Reimagine LA Coalition, which backed up and helped to pass Measure J in LA County at the previous November 2020 election. Why do we say care, not cops? It's because Black people comprise 13% of the US population, but roughly 30% of those who are arrested. Black people are 35% of those imprisoned. Black people are 42% of those on death row. And Black people are 56% of those serving life sentences. So we say care, not cops, and we want to invest in care, not cops, in order to save families and to save lives. Next slide. So, police budget aside, we're going to transition now into the overall city budget process. These are our decision makers. We've got the mayor, Robert Garcia, who proposes the annual budget priorities. And we've got over here in the green, the city manager, Tom Modica, who advises the council and the mayor on the budget goals. The city manager here is a really, really key decision maker. And the budget that came out in late July, the city budget that came out in late July, this was the city manager's budget. The city manager works with the departments in dark purple below to implement or to create and then to implement the council, mayoral, and city manager recommendations. So the departments work with the city manager to create their departmental budgets. The city manager then proposes the budget, and the city council in light purple reviews the proposed budget, suggests new ideas. Cut a little bit here, add a little bit there. The city council towards the end of the budget process weighs in and brings in their priorities. Within the City Council, there's also the Budget Oversight Committee, which is comprised of 3 out of the 9 City Council members. Those 3 members are Al Austin from District 8, Susie Price from District 3, and Roberto Uranga from District 7. It was actually a shakeup of the of the Budget Oversight Committee based on last year's uprisings. Al Austin came into the Budget Oversight Committee chairmanship after the uprisings. So frankly, the city management and the mayor put a black man at the head of the budget committee only after the uprisings of last year. Next slide. This is the typical timeline of the budget process. And when I say typical, this year is actually pretty non-typical. December to March, the city reviews the finances and the city manager provides the initial framework of the budget. In April, the departments complete their recommendations and send them to the city manager. From May to July, the city manager and the mayor and the council, they kind of weigh in on their initial goals and they finalize their goals to then propose in August the city budget proposal. Typically the mayor and the city manager release the budget together in August. This actually was totally bumped up this year in July. Was done at the end of July. And there will be council public hearings in August. In September is when the city council, early September, is when the city council adopts the budget and the mayor finally approves the budget. And that's the typical timeline for how the city budget is proposed and then adopted. Next slide. This year was not a typical year. In March of this year, we actually had a mini People's Budget campaign when the City Council approved the Long Beach Recovery Act, which is set to allocate about $249.3 million in federal and state dollars for Long Beach's economic recovery, health, safety, and city service maintenance. This was actually really early on, really early to sort of determine all of the Recovery Act allocations. Many cities and counties in California are actually doing their Recovery Act allocations right now. So the city of Long Beach and sort of our mini People's Budget campaign back in March did this very early on to set the Recovery Act priorities very early on. Next slide. But even with the Recovery Act, about $250 million in federal and state dollars, this is not enough. This is not enough to cover the community's not only thriving needs, but basic needs in this most traumatic and challenging of times. So this is the role then of the People's Budget. We're saying, no, we need more for the community. Don't just throw, $250 million and think that's enough. That's not enough. It's never been enough. The People's Budget is calling for specifically a divestment from the Long Beach Police Department and a reinvestment in Black lives, communities of color, and marginalized communities. Number one, we're calling for reimagined community safety. There's a lot that goes into that I don't have time to cover in this presentation right now. But please go to the People's Budget on the Long Beach Forward website. There'll be a URL in the next slide to read more about what reimagined community safety means. Number two, we're calling for a rental housing division in the city government to centralize a place and a public place for tenants and landlords to get information on all of the different and changing tenant and landlord policies and laws. Number 3, we're demanding a right to counsel for all renters, a right to legal counsel and eviction defense for all renters. Number 4, we're calling for community land trusts to take back community ownership of land and housing and permanently affordable housing. Number 5, we're calling for language access and language justice in accordance with the city's own language access policy. Number 6, youth recovery. Number 7, older adult protections. Number 8, universal legal representation for immigrants. And number 9, digital inclusion. Next slide. How do we get to all of those investments? We are calling for the defunding of the Long Beach Police Department by 25%. That's $65 million. And that will cover $65 million will cover the police, $65 million will cover the people's budget, the entire people's budget, and more. This is how we propose to pay for the people's budget, is to defund the police budget by $65 million. Next slide. You can read more and take action at the lbforward.org/people's budget. There's lots of links on taking action, including a click to email the mayor and city council member. Next slide. And finally, just to reiterate, this is our call to action. This series here is a part of a series of teach-ins that began this past weekend, will continue tonight, and will follow on through tomorrow at the police budget hearing at City Council, Tuesday, August 10th, 5:00 p.m. Next slide. Tomorrow is our day of action at City Hall. Again, Tuesday, August 10th. We're starting at 3 p.m. 3 p.m. is the Budget Oversight Committee, in which we'd love for folks to come out to provide in-person public comment, or you can submit your public comment online. And then 5 p.m., and this is really what we're pushing for. 5 p.m. is the start of the City Council meeting, which is the budget hearing on both, and sort of ironically, both Health and Human Services. Again, that gets 1% of the city budget, and the Police Department, which this year is getting 42% of the city budget or the general fund. Both of these departments are going to have their hearings together. And so we're calling on folks, please come out to City Hall 5 p.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, August 10th, and participate in those budget hearings. But more importantly, our police budget and harm of policing teach-in outside City Hall. It's going to be a community gathering. We're going to have music. Please bring your lawn chairs or blankets. Please, please, please do mask up. We want to be as safe as possible here. That's why we're holding this event outdoors. But we're really, we'll have a number of speakers, and we want you to both participate in the day of action outside City Hall, as well as go inside the council chambers and provide your public comment on why you want Care Not Cops, why you want to defund LBPD, why you want to divest $65 million from the Long Beach Police Department to fund the people's budget and then some. Why we need care, not cops. So with that, I think I will end it here. I'm not sure if we have any questions or comments from the audience, but really we're calling you to action tomorrow, Tuesday, August 10th. 3 p.m. is the Budget Oversight Committee, and 5 p.m. is our big day of action outside City Hall. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I think we can close it. If I can get my tech admins to help me out here.